And welcome back. Thank you for joining us for our first segment. And we have with us on set these beautiful ladies. We have with us the Executive Director of NCFC, Ms. Margaret Last. We also have Dr. Susan Kasedde, who is the UNICEF representative to Belize. And we have Tisa, who's the Liaison Officer for UNFPA Belize. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
And welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Talking about a very interesting topic today, and I know before we started this segment you were talking about your previous appearance, which I wasn't here for, but I think clearly when we see a topic of child marriage or early union, it's a bit concerning that we're having this conversation in 2019. And so I want to use that as our launching point for the conversation, understanding exactly what child marriage and early union is and what are the protection mechanisms currently in place. Who wants to take it? Ms. Nick?
Let me say good morning to our viewers and the opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. 2019, yes, this is where we are. However, this is a conversation that has been going on for quite a while. Yeah. We are happy, however, that we're at this juncture. The National Committee for Families and Children actually developed a national strategy and action plan to end violence against children and adolescents. And we have, in that plan, there are 8 strategic focus areas. And strategic area number 2 looks directly at how we reduce the problem of early marriages and how we change norms and values to come to that place. And so we were extremely happy to partner with UNICEF and UNFPA and CAMI funds to bring this to reality. As we look around, we note that the problem is escalating. It is really and truly getting to a point where, notwithstanding the fact that we have a legal age of consent for marriage, that we are seeing younger and younger persons getting married. And I believe that having the evidence base, which was a mixed survey, which really and truly speak to the whole issue as the statistics and the concerns, that one had to delve into it. And so we are happy that we are actually now looking at the problem. We held the 2 days consultation on the 26th and the 27th of September last year, as you know. And we had stakeholders from all across the country. We had the churches, we had NGOs, we had civil society, we had government. The national strategy is actually managed by the Child Protection Technical Working Force, which is, of course, made up of the same persons, the government, education, police, judiciary, and, of course, UNICEF, all makes up the technical working group, which its focus is to end, in fact, violence against children in all forms, not only in early marriages, but as I said, we had 8 focus areas, but this right now is on the table. And quite a lot has gone into the whole preparation, and quite a lot has been happening even after the 2 days consultations. Because as you know, we have the consultants on board through the assistance of UNICEF and UNFPA and CAMI funds. And the consultants, apart from the consultations that were held with the stakeholders at the consultation, did even wider consultations and did desk reviews, and there's so much going on because the idea is not just to have a discussion, but to have actions that is really going to accelerate the whole eventuality of ending the problem of early marriage and early unions.
While we're talking about early marriage, I want to go back a little because this is you identified as a problem.
An escalating problem.
An escalating problem, and I wanted to get to that a bit later, but just the fact that it is a problem.
Yes.
This is a problem which was legal. I mean, early marriages was a legal policy in terms of one being able to get married from, I think, age 16, I believe.
Well, if you recall, Kevin, prior to 20...
Is that age correct?
Prior to 2005, it was at 14.
14. So
that was the age.
So I wanted you to go into some of the, to understand why was that policy, to go into the thinking of why that policy, because it's an artificially placed number.
Yes.
I don't know how they came up with it, and maybe you can assist us to say what was the policy. All laws are informed by a policy. What was the policy that justified the age of 14 allowing young people to marry?
I think that the issue is that child marriage is an ongoing problem because it's a reflection of some of these manifestations of gender inequality that have persisted for a very long time. The laws are as good as the underlying assumptions, attitudes, norms, practices that prevailed at the time that they were put into force. And child marriage is an example of that. What we as a society viewed as the entitlements and rights of girls is reflected in the laws around, when a girl could take on an adult role such as marriage. UNICEF views child marriage, the marriage of anyone under the age of 18, as a gross violation of the rights of the child. Because we know that a girl who is married, a boy who is married, is unable to benefit from all of the other rights that entail from continued education, free social engagement with peers, to play and develop. But we also know that it has effects on health and development. And overall potential for the child and for their family. So we see this as a gross violation of rights, and indeed, in many countries, it is entrenched in and enabled by policy. 12 million girls worldwide are married before the age of 18 every year. In Belize, the data that Ms. Nicholas was talking about shows that 1 in 5 persons are married within the age group 15 to 19. 1 in 5 women are married in that age group. Certainly 15 to 17-year-olds are girls among them. And then
the state has been grossly wrong in the way that it's been treating our young women as it relates to marriage.
So we have not been fair.
It's a gross indictment on the state.
It is a gross indictment on society, and society creates the laws and policies that govern the way that we live. And that's why this conversation is really important. The work that the NCFC is leading and the government of Belize is leading to address the gaps in legislation, the contradictions in legislation, and to put in place measures to protect and provide for all children so that they are free of this kind of violation is really critical, and we welcome this.
It's very important to have clarity in the conversation. And so we spoke of the legal age for marriage consent of 14, but that has been changed.
Yes, yes.
That was up until
2005.
And it was changed to
16.
16.
So the legal age, the age of consent now is 16.
So a 16-year-old young girl in Belize can say, I want to get married.
I want to have sex. I want to have sex. A 16-year-old can only marry with parental consent. Okay, so while the 16-year-old can say, yes, under the law that I could have sex, I could consent to sex, she cannot marry without parental consent. Because while the legal age of marriage is set at 18, there is the provision where with parental consent, you can be married at 16.
You were saying, Tisa?
No, I was just adding to what Ms. Nicholas was saying, that it's at the age of 16 with parental consent, and then at 18, a young person can say, yes, I want to get married without having to get permission from anyone.
Right.
Are there any justifications that a parent has to give to say, I legally allow my 16-year-old daughter to get married?
Well, these are some of the very concerns that we have. Because if we go back, and I hate going back, but sometimes we need to for context, right? But why would I want my 14-year-old to be married? Why would I want my 16-year-old to be married if I am really and truly cognizant of all of the developmental issues and so on and so forth? So I believe that when we were able to move the age from 14 to 16, we were able to convince the policymakers and so on and so forth, that was not in the best interest of the child, going back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I believe that we need, and that is why now we are having this kind of discussion again, so that people could be aware, so that parents can be aware, so that our younger girls that are coming up are not caught up in the very same situation, so that we don't see culture, because sometimes it is, people say it is not legal, it is culture, so that we understand that culture does not override what is in the best interest of any of our children, so no child will be left behind. So that we understand, because we really need to understand that, as the representative said, at 16 years old, yes, we would, but then can that person really and truly, you know, and what are the reasons? And I think that is one of the things that the consultation really did, was to drive, to look to see what are the drivers.
I'm a bit confused here, and I want to
Yes.
allow you to give me some, to provide some clarity. The age of consent for sex is 16.
Yes.
But you cannot be married at that age unless your parents say yes. So the parents don't have to allow you to have sex, but they have to allow you to get married.
Yes.
I'm not sure, we've always had some miscommunication about the age that a child can access sexual and reproductive health services. So if I am 16, I get pregnant, can I go to a hospital? Can I go to a clinic? Can I get services on my own? Next is looking at the definition of what we consider a child, which is 18. And we have been hearing consistently of this issue of teenage pregnancy. Once upon a time, we were told it was high as 1 in every 4 live births, and I don't know if it's changed, increased, decreased, you can correct me, was to a child under 18. So we clearly have a very visible gray area that the laws are not aligning. How is this so?
Okay, you brought up a very important issue, the sexual and reproductive health, because that is one of the identified drivers of child marriage and early unions, as well as one of the effects, the adolescent pregnancy, which you're talking about. Mixed 2011, we had a rate of 64, the adolescent birth rate being at 64 for every 1,000 adolescent population or live births. And we currently have, with the last mix, 2015, it's at 74. So that would indicate some bit of an increase. The Ministry of Health will report that the numbers have been consistent over the years. There's minor change, but the number is still alarming. Belize has one of the highest adolescent birth rate in the entire Caribbean. As it relates to child marriage and early unions, we are considered the second highest in terms of the prevalence of child marriage and early unions. And I think it's important for us to take into context here that for Belize, we have more of an issue with early unions than we do with the actual child marriage and the legal marriage.
What's the difference?
Because a marriage is a legal contract.
Yes.
And this is why a 16-year-old cannot enter into a marriage without parental consent, because for you to enter into a contract, you have to be of a legal adult age. This is why there is some difference with the age of consent versus the age of marriage, which requires parental consent at 16. So these are things that we have to take into consideration when we have the conversation about consent, age of consent, and the age of marriage. And it's important not to confuse the two, because the issue of child marriage and early union is really one of a protection issue.
And what about the age to access health services?
The age to access health services, the laws do not explicitly say anything about an adolescent not having access, but we know that there are challenges for our young people.
Doctors who say, I can't see you unless you have a parent.
Yes, and the Ministry of Health as a whole promotes universal access and coverage. And so a young person should be able to access the services. But young people are having different experiences based on where they might be trying to access these services. And the services might not be done in such a youth-friendly way as to welcome or encourage them accessing the services that they might need to enhance their sexual and reproductive health. So this is one of the issues that we have to grapple with, and this is something that is also being addressed in a different strategy being developed, which is the National Comprehensive Adolescent Health Strategy, which we're not necessarily here to talk about, but that is one of the issues being addressed in that strategy as well, the child marriage and early unions.
So before we move any further into the conversation, I know your consultations and the consultant that you've hired is really, their purpose was to get a clear picture as to the problem. What are we seeing?
So that's perfect, because I had wanted to add to what Ms. Nick was talking about earlier. In terms of why this continues to persist, the data shows us very clearly that if you are poorer, if you have less education, and in certain geographic areas, particularly Stand Creek District, Belize City South Side, you are more likely to enter into a marriage before the age of 18. That's what the data shows. And I think that this is important for us to reflect on, because if the lines of vulnerability are drawn around your poverty status, your access to education, where you live, whether it's a place that is predominantly defined by culture or access to services, then there needs to be more than just a change in legislation to address this issue. We need to recognize that there is a collective accountability, and each of us has a role to play in order to change and address the conditions that enable the continuation of this kind of violation against the rights of children. We need families and communities to know their duties to protect children. We need them to understand what the law states. Belize has signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and has signed on to and committed to put in place every measure to protect children from this kind of violation of the rights of the child. But the government can't act alone. It needs civil society, it needs parents, it needs everyone to do what they can to create conditions that make sure that your access to protection does not depend on whether you have income, or whether you've continued school, or whether you come from a particular cultural group.
No,
I'd like to complement what Dr. Suzanne is saying before we move on, because she raised an important issue about poverty. But Belize has some very interesting nuances, because the issue of poverty comes into play when we're talking about females. But when we look at the numbers, it is the child marriage early unions numbers are higher for males that are in the richer quintiles, but for females in the poorer quintiles. So it's...
Quintiles?
Well, how do I explain quintiles? In people who are of a lower income bracket, women who are of a lower income bracket tend to have a higher number of prevalence of child marriage and early unions versus the males who have a higher income bracket. So it might speak something to the partnering of young girls with men who are whether they're young or older, who have income. Yes, so it's interesting, because the poverty is not necessarily an overall indicator or driver for Belize, because when you break down the numbers, you see that it varies by sex. So that's one of an important issue. And
that's interesting. You're saying that what is happening, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that the data is showing that richer men are marrying poorer, younger women.
It is showing that the issue of child marriage, and early unions affect girls who are of lower income and males who are of a higher income.
Little boys and little girls.
Okay, I'm trying to get the layman appreciation of it, but I guess the scientific one is the most accurate description of it, because I understand it in the layman's way. But you were talking earlier about not conflating the two things, early sexual activity with child marriage. But it seems to me that that is what we're doing, in terms of we're going at early marriages, but really what the study is showing and what the real concern is early sexual activity and what that means. Could you separate it for us in terms of what the importance of in going as the headliner being attacking early marriage, as opposed to saying, listen, you're not supposed to have sex till you're 18, you could just go there?
Well, the reality is...
And can I also ask this quickly, get it in quickly? The other issue is, does this mean that we are speaking differently as to what marriage means? Because when I asked the question earlier, in my parents' day, being married meant that this knew your problem. So you took my daughter, it's your problem now, and so there was a social expectation that a marriage meant that there was an evolution of responsibility, that you're now a woman, that you are now in a union that will take off. Is it that we're saying that marriages have less functionality, that they're working less, in addition to all the other disbenefits of marrying early? Could you answer those two things for me?
You want to answer the profile of
the issue of marriage, early marriage, because that is what we're concerned about.
Yes.
I think that to respond to your question, we need to look at what are the drivers of early marriage. You may recall, Kevin, and I'm sure you may or may not, but in earlier days, children were getting married at an earlier age to protect someone. So it was not about a matter of love and that kind of thing. It was just to ensure, for instance, that you don't go to prison.
That was
because you impregnated a child under the age of consent.
The law. And there was a whole issue of carnal knowledge and that kind of thing.
Unlawful carnal knowledge.
And unlawful carnal. So children were getting parents were marrying off their children to ensure that there was protection for a man who actually committed a crime.
Yes.
And so the age was changed to 16 because it was obvious that people were taking advantage of not only the child, but parents themselves were giving away their children because of whatever protection issues were needed, and of course because of the whole issue of sometimes poverty, because we had then and we still have the whole sugar daddy syndrome and so on and so forth. Now today we look at it and we're at 16 when we can get married with parental consent. But when we look at some of the drivers, we are very cognizant of the fact that it's not, all of it is not only about a love relationship. It's not only about that kind of thing. It might be, as you rightfully said, a parent who says, well, my responsibility is finished. So you go now, you get married, and you look after yourself. But can you really look after yourself? You know that we have just recently passed a piece of legislation where after 1 year, if you're married and both of you consent, you can be divorced.
Yeah. By consent.
But by consent. But how does that affect the 16-year-old? How does that affect the 16-year-old? Because the law is silent. So what is the opportunity then for that 16-year-old? Is that 16-year-old, has that 16-year-old completed high school? What is that person's status and that kind of thing? And I'm not saying that at 16 you can't fall in love, because I guess you can.
I was in love at 16.
But yes, you can. But are you ready for the actual marriage and the commitment
and the responsibility?
And the responsibility, because it's a huge responsibility. Developmentally, are you really ready? You know, so I think that these are some of the things. And you talk about going strictly to 18. That was where I wanted to go from day one.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I am saying that that is where we should go. We are saying under our Constitution, which is the supreme law, that a child is any person under the age of 18. So why even bother then to go to 16 or 14?
So Ms. Nick, what accounts for this dance? What accounts for this dance that we're half stepping, 2 steps forward, we're creeping, 14 to 16, look around to 18?
Yes. Well, we have to know, and that is why now as we operationalize the roadmap, we have to ensure that the policies and the legislation now suits the purpose, which is to ensure now that if we are going to reform, if we're going to look at legislation, let us do the children's code. Let us do a children's code, and let us say that a child is a person under the age of 18 and therefore X, Y, and Z. And then here comes the other question, and this question was asked when we posed it. So what are we going to do? Are we going to criminalize every child that are involved in sex? Because then it will change the age of sexual consent. It will change it will remove the provision from the Marriage Act. But what we want the state the society and everybody to understand that a child is a child, and it is a person who is under the age of 18. That will be in conformity with our Constitution, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and therein we should have any further problems if we can afford to get to that place.
But why would the age of marriage? A marriage is a legal contract. That's all it is.
Yes,
It's a legal contract, and somebody who is even a minor can enter into employment contract, for example.
Employment contract, yes.
But why is it you're saying that it would change the age of consent? Marriage and age of consent are two thorough things, you're saying, Creole.
Yes, it is two thorough things, but the thing is, if I can have sex at 16, the questions will come. Then why can I not get married at 16?
Because marriage is a legal contract which has other ramifications. So that's why you can't do it then.
I agree.
That's why, for example, in the US, you have sometimes the age for drinking or clubbing.
Yes.
Clubbing is 18, but the age to drink is 21.
It's
so you can go to the club if you want.
Yes, but you're not supposed to be drinking. But the thing is that for a long time, Kevin, our laws and the disparities in it have created what we have today.
The very confusion
the
we're
very
trying to address.
confusion.
Yeah.
And so that is what I think we need to set at ease.
There's one thing that I know won't be confusing, and we haven't talked about it yet, and it's concerning me. What is the impact on a child who is, whether forcibly or willingly, in an early child marriage or early union?
So the roadmap that Belize is developing is supposed to address this. We want to see, as a key outcome of this work, child marriage and early unions being prevented. We don't want to see this happen anymore. And we recognize that that's going to require some adjustments in the law to make sure that that's clarified. But we also, as I said earlier, need to address public education and awareness, because the law alone will not help us achieve this change in protection. So we want, through this roadmap, to address prevention. We also want to make sure that we pay special attention to children who are already in early unions, because we know for these children, their rights to access education, to make sure that they are included in appropriate social groups for their development and for healthy growth and development of their own families, are already being curtailed right now. And so the roadmap and the follow-up is going to include these two critical strands: attending to children whose rights have already been violated, so that we can help them ensure that they achieve the benefits of any protections and support, but also to make sure that we prevent through legal, but also public education, through partnership with civil society actors, as well as state institutions, and access to services.
But what are the long-term implications? I mean, is there development stunted? Is it mental? What are we seeing as the implications? Because perhaps parents don't understand. Sometimes we see our teens starting to act like adults and we feel they are until they do something and you remember they're not. And so maybe they don't understand the harm that they cause in allowing for it to happen.
We have developed a country profile for Belize, and that would talk about the situation in country. What are the data that, as it relates to Belize? Global trends show that the impact of it has to do, it limits your educational opportunities, puts you at risk for gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual violence. It also puts you at risk for adolescent pregnancy, STIs, HIV, AIDS. So there's a lot of things that can happen to a young person who enters into a marriage early. For us in Belize, our data is not sufficient to say what is the impact it's having on our young people. But because the adolescent population in any country, and including Belize, is so large, anything that affects a cohort of people so large will eventually affect an entire nation. So if we are limiting the choices and the opportunities for our young people, it is going to have a larger impact on society. We might think that it affects the young person individually only, but it's going to have an impact on all of us if we do not check this situation very quickly.
Let me ask very quickly. Your quick facts talks about 1 out of every 5 women in Belize aged 15 to 19 is currently married or in a marital union.
Correct.
The age 15 for a marriage is illegal.
When we talk to partners on the ground, our community-based organizations and civil society organizations, they report issues of young people entering into marriages that they think they are married. They get married in a church, but it does not continue on to an actual legal marriage. And this is something that they themselves are not aware of. And this happens more in smaller communities, maybe rural areas where we have all these different pop-up churches and so on. So that's part of the issue why we would see something like that.
I want to just add to that, because the data that you just quoted does combine marriage with early union.
Yeah.
And we know that with this practice, as with many of the challenging phenomena, we do have underreporting. And in Belize, we know that while we may not have the majority of those informal marriages, we know that there are many in long-term informal unions into which they entered as children, in which they have responsibilities, physical, financial, and social, that bear no difference on the face from those of someone in marriage. So we know that the effects on the child are equally as detrimental to these children in terms of exclusion, curtailing of their access to opportunities, and their own individual developments, and the intergenerational transmission of poverty and vulnerability.
Go ahead.
I'm curious, because I'm trying to think of when you put a proposal on the table, because I'm really at 18, honestly. I think it's just, doesn't make any sense. And nobody can justify to me why it would not be 18 for marriage, because I hear you say that early marriage puts you at risk for AIDS and other things, but I think you're meaning sexual activity, because marriage itself is just the contract, it's the reflection of what the union is. But my concern was, when you sit around the table and you say, listen, let's put this thing at 18, man, it don't make no sense. Ms. Nick says that. What do the people on the other side who are opposing going to 18 saying? I'm curious. Things come to my head, like, for example, that it's a Eurocentric number. Maybe it's not something that is germane to this side of the world. Or maybe someone is saying that it's not culturally, it's culturally insensitive, because there are other cultures, for example, maybe, just for argument's sake, I've had this discussion before, the Mayan community have a different cultural standpoint, and it's not just an insulting thing, it's just simply what the culture has been for eons. I know that the argument in the past was, listen, life expectancy was not what it was, so that's why the ages were reflective of when you got married. So it wasn't that people were pedophiles and nasty people back then that they were marrying at 14. It was so simply that, listen, we weren't going to live until we were 105. So my question is, what are the people on the other side of the table who are giving any sort of resistance to the end, to action that will end early childhood marriages? What are they saying?
I wanted to clarify though, because you mentioned that the risk, I just wanted to point out that a young person entering into a marriage, there are some power relations at play when a young person enters into a marriage. And even though it affects both our girls and our boys, it affects our girls more. So this is why there's a risk for HIV and AIDS, because that power, they're not empowered to negotiate, that they will use condoms or access health services as they need. So it puts them at risk. This is why there's an increased risk for gender-based violence, because now you're at the mercy of your husband, if I'm speaking in terms of a girl. So this is why these things are risk for somebody who enters into an early marriage. In terms of opposition to increasing the age to 18, I would allow Ms. Nick to answer that question, because I would like to say here, though, that in the consultation last year, some interesting facts came out. Because there was a time in Belize when we had the age of marriage at 21. Yes. Many years ago.
Wow.
Yes.
How
In
did it ever go from
in
1924,
I think.
Yes.
1924, if I'm recalling correctly. Wow. And so that was very eye-opening and interesting for us. And so
we don't know. We don't know why it went all the way down to 14.
Why was it at 21? That's
I don't know.
That's a good research topic.
Yes, it is a good research topic. And the thing is, that was offered to us by the Honorable Chief Justice.
And it's interesting to him as well, and he is doing his investigation
to
understand for himself better what was the situation.
So what I'm hearing is that there is an opposition that just perhaps hasn't been sufficient momentum to push for the change to move to a legal age of 18. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly. Belize has signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And by doing that, as with all other nations, Belize has committed to make sure that we realize our own obligation and fulfill.
Almost the front of the line.
Correct. And so, you know, in 2014, UNICEF, UNFPA signed on to a global program to support ending of child marriages, recognizing that it's a challenge across multiple countries. In this region, Belize is really ahead of the line in trying to address this comprehensively, addressing legislation and any ambiguity in legislation is one aspect. But again, what we recognize is that there may not necessarily be opposition, but we need to not assume that there is 100% clarity on duties and on the law. So public education, collaboration with the media to communicate about this, and then stakeholder engagement, civil society collaboration at the national level in terms of these different program and policy changes, but also on the ground in terms of outreach and education, and then strengthening of data to understand what's driving it where. You know, these are all the things that we're going to be working on with the NCFC to ensure that we accompany Belize in achieving the fulfillment of its duty under the CRC in ending this gross violation of children's rights.
I'm very curious.
And I completely agree with Dr. Susan, because wherever there might be opposition, because I'm sure there is some opposition, but I think that information, as she has said, and public education, because I think when people look at something and it looks okay, it looks normal, and we don't understand the implications, and especially when it affects us directly, then we may have a tendency towards that. But I think once people grasp the overall concept, the holistic diagnostic of what we are talking about our children and how we help them to grow and develop to their full potentials. And I think once we can get, even through parenting, whatever we need to use as the tools to get the message out there. And so I completely agree that consultation, public education, continuous pressure and society coming and advocacy, we can do it. So
I'm very curious, because in your consultations, what was the response from the different sectors that you had represented there? Because I'll be very honest. I think a lot of people are naive to the fact that this is a problem that still exists in our society. Perhaps we've just been blind to it. And I also know that for a very long time, similar to what Kevin said, and I don't want to perpetuate it, but it has always been a rural issue. But you clearly said Southside Belize City, and I don't think we should miss that as well. Because you're talking the most densely populated urban area, you're talking Stan Creek, and it's not necessarily the communities that we once assumed this was taking place in, that you found in your data that it actually exists. So take me back to that stakeholder consultation. Is it that we have had blinders on, ignoring it, or is it so clandestine that we just are not able to see it?
I think that's a really good question. The data is really important. The 2015 mix, which we put out with, which UNICEF supported the Statistics Institute of Belize to put out, really helped us to establish data to clarify in the different geographical areas within Belize, what does it look like in terms of child marriage and early unions. And so we have a very clear look now to help us get a better understanding of this practice. And we need to use that data to support community consultations and planning at the community level so that we understand and have a more honest conversation about the relevance of topics such as this in our individual communities. I think we've hidden on issues like sexual exploitation, child marriage, and early unions. These things tend to get hidden or protected behind this veil of privacy and my right to privacy. But when that privacy infringes on the rights of another, particularly a child, over whom state and other actors have a duty to protect, then we have to have a conversation. And that's why this work is really critical.
One of the things about the data, though, and it's going to be very interesting, I really hope Galen or UB is looking at this and sits down with the data, because there was another project I was involved in that was dealing with persons who are actually on the South Side and the population of the South Side. And so Marlene was asking about it being a real issue for metropolitan areas and not just rural areas. But in that study, it found that a lot of the immigrants, the illegal immigrants from across the border, for example, go into the poverty-stricken areas of the South Side. And you have a lot of people from the rural communities coming into the South Side because the North Side is normally landholders and the cost of housing on that. So it might not be that there is a disparity between where this is happening. So my appeal is for them to actually look behind the numbers. But in terms of going forward, what specific action? Because to my mind, this is a strictly legal issue. You go into the house and you say, listen, all in favor say aye, this is now 18. That's where the money is. The money is the remedial things to actually fix and to deal with where society is on it, is the advocacy you're talking about, which is afterwards, to my mind. Because following up to Marlene's question, where are you getting resistance? It can't be the church. Look at the major stakeholders. The church cannot be saying man, you should have stayed at 16. It cannot be the, I don't know, the lawmakers. It cannot be the public servants, the teachers. There's no one who's really saying this should stay at 16 for marriage. I wonder where you get the most resistance. So what specific action, because the theme is accelerating action to end child marriage and early unions in Belize. What specific actions are being taken to move the legislative post, which is the only post defining what early is? When you say early, it's a legal definition. What specific action are we taking to move the legal goalposts?
Because there are so many factors at play, and because for Belize, in the informal unions tend to be more of an issue. I won't say more of an issue, but it's an equally important issue, and I think we have a higher prevalence of early unions versus child marriage, that just moving the age to 18 does not address the issue. Because like I said, we have young people getting married even before what is now the legal age of marriage, as thinking that they're married. So the public information and awareness is very important. We also need to understand better what are those relationships that we have in country that define that early union, because this is something that still is pending a definition for us, because there's so many faces of the informal unions in Belize. And how do we address that? How do we expand opportunities for our young people so that they don't feel forced to go into a union? The consultation last year, when they did a focus group with the young people, they were saying that, well, some of them do it because maybe they got kicked out of their homes. So economically, it's easier to survive if you're shacking up with somebody than if you were on your own. So there are so many factors involved that just moving the goalpost from 16 to 18 does not.
I'm confused because I thought that we're focusing on, what is the focus? Is there a focus early unions? Because early unions really means age of sexual consent. Or are we focusing on marriage? Because what you're referring to, you just said that the difference, the bigger problem is really with early unions.
We're addressing it collectively.
Yes. Oh, let me clarify if I may.
Please.
Early unions.
Help me.
Early unions in this context refers to long-term cohabiting relationships.
Common law. What we call common law.
Correct. It's not just early sex. It's not early sex. Early sexual activity is a different issue. They're related, of course, and some early sexual activity may result in a long-term relationship, a long-term union. But early unions in this context is a relationship that looks like a marriage but does not have that legal contract that we were talking about. So in Belize, the most common type of relationship that is of a marriage type is involving children is an early union rather than a child marriage. But when we look at the data, we ask children, we ask at the household level, is anyone in this household married or in an early union, and what is their age, so that we can capture children who have entered into long-term relationships that involve sex and that carry responsibilities that are similar to marriage.
Let me just, because we're running out of time, and I want to talk about what is taking place. You are putting together your roadmap. So in other words, it's getting the process started for the advocacy and all the other components that we've mentioned here. Tell me how you're going to put it together.
Well, we actually have a draft
already. Yeah.
Already, the map has already been drafted.
Yeah.
Today, the participants will be validating.
Yeah.
So it is with consultations from all stakeholders, because we have some proposed, within the draft, there are some proposed actions.
Yeah.
And persons who are responsible and that kind of thing. And today we are going to be looking to the stakeholders for them to validate and to see if this is exactly where we need to go, because it has to be a consultative process.
In terms of prioritized actions, what do you see being the first step?
Well, there's several. I mean, there's some things that can be done.
We could only take the first bite of the elephant,
but
right?
Yes. But I mean, one of the first things that I think that we want to do is to ensure that we have commitment. Okay. Because I think commitment from stakeholders, and we need to ensure that we have a proper implementation mechanism. Because if you don't have a proper implementation mechanism, which is also made up of a proper monitoring and evaluation strategy or mechanism, then we would start right at the right place. So those are some of the first things that we want to put in place at the end of the consultation today. And then we move forward. In relation to the whole issue of legislation, the Policy and Legal Committee for the subcommittee for NCFC is at this point addressing some of those issues and trying to make those recommendations for the changes that we want in terms of ensuring that a child is a child is a child on the age piece of legislation, because we're looking at a children's code. And so we are hoping that that will be done at the end of 2019. That is where we are striving to
go. Legislative change.
Yes, that is where we're striving to go. And that is going to take care of a lot of the issues. It is, and one of the things that I want to say is that we need Kevin for you and Marlene at any point to drop in to the...
More Marlene, she's good at these things.
You too, as a lawyer, to drop in at the Radisson and to get a feel of what actually is out there. Because one of the things that we also recognize as we looked at the consultation and as we talk about children who are being married at 50 is who are conducting these marriages. And that also tells us that we need a lot of work to do with the churches, with the religious persons who are marrying children. Maybe, I don't know if it's ignorance of the law, we don't really know what it is.
Or they support.
Falsified documents.
Or they support.
Or what it is, right? But the thing is that this law gives us an opportunity, based on the data, based on the consultations, to start to develop some strategies also to address that, so that we don't continue to have this kind of problem. It cannot be a quiet subject anymore. It has to be out there. It has to stay on the table, and that is just what it is.
Well, we thank you for coming in and reminding us that this is a problem that our children are still facing in this country, although I'm sure many people weren't aware of it and perhaps don't want to believe it. Your data is clear and your work is set out for you.
And that's the evidence.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming in and enlightening us.
Thank you. Thank you, Marlene.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking to representatives of the Film and Media Arts Unit of NICH about a traveling Caribbean film showcase. Stay tuned.